If this story moved you, take a moment to share it. Let someone know that small acts of kindness can change the world in ways we never see coming. Because in a world that too often tells us to look away, it's the quiet, unyielding courage of people like Ella that remind us of who we can be. If you've ever chosen compassion over convenience, if you've ever seen someone who needed help and offered it without question, you're part of this story too. So leave a comment, share your thoughts, and let us know. Have you ever witnessed kindness stand taller than power? Subscribe to Blacklens Stories for more real-life tales of decency and courage that prove even the smallest voice can make a difference. Because sometimes, it only takes one person to remind us what matters. Ma's in the heart of Savannah, Georgia, where Spanish moss draped from ancient oaks, and the air always smelled faintly of salt and stories. The Elm Tree Café stood as a quiet haven on a bustling street corner, its weathered brick facade and green awning beckoning locals and wanderers alike. Inside, the warm aroma of freshly ground coffee beans danced with the scent of cinnamon rolls just pulled from the oven, weaving through the morning chatter like a comforting melody. Behind the counter, Ella Johnson moved with the calm precision of someone who had spent years perfecting the art of grace under pressure. At 32, she had seen enough to know that most people never looked beyond the foam on their lattes or the swirl of caramel in their cappuccinos, but she did. She saw the stories in the lines etched across a regular's forehead, the tremor in a young mother's voice as she ordered decaf to calm her shaking hands, the loneliness in the eyes of a businessman who never quite met her gaze. Today was no different, though the rain that had pelted Savannah all morning had left her sneakers soggy and her hair curling in damp ringlets. She wiped the steam from the espresso machine's gauge, her mind already racing ahead to the next order, the next small act of quiet kindness. Sam, a college kid with wide eyes and a nervous energy, fumbled with a tray of mismatched mugs, nearly sending a latte crashing to the floor. Ella caught it just in time, her hand steady, her smile warm. "Slow down, Sam," she murmured, the words soft but sure. "They're not going anywhere." Sam exhaled, his shoulders easing. Around them, the cafe hummed like a well-rehearsed orchestra, spoons clinking, orders called out in a sing-song rhythm, the muted buzz of conversations in every corner. Ella's fingertips drummed against the counter, the habit of a lifetime spent in the background, unnoticed but essential. It was then that the door swung open with the quiet jingle of the brass bell overhead, a sound she had heard 1,000 times, but somehow always made her pause. In the doorway stood a man who looked like he had been carved from the oldest parts of the world. His frame was thin, shoulders stooped under the weight of years, his coat worn to threads at the cuffs. His eyes were a stormy blue, clouded with memories he carried like metals no one could see. The world inside the cafe didn't stop for him. People sipped their drinks, screens flickered with news they wouldn't remember, a toddler wailed in the corner booth. But Ella saw him. She saw the way his hands trembled as he clutched the brass handle of the door, the way his breath fogged the glass with each careful step. She stepped forward before she could think, wiping her palms on her apron, her voice gentle as the rain that still whispered outside. "Sir," she said, meeting his gaze, "can I help you find a seat?" He blinked, confusion flickering across his face like a shadow. I think I was supposed to meet someone," he rasped, each word a struggle. His coat fell open just enough for Ella to glimpse the dull gleam of dog tags, a name she couldn't read and a past she couldn't know. "Well, let's start with something warm," she offered, her tone wrapping around the moment like a promise. She guided him to a small table by the window, one with a view of the wet cobblestones and the slow-moving world beyond. "I'll be right back," she said, and he nodded, his eyes already drifting to the rain-slick street as if it held all the answers he had forgotten. Back behind the counter, Sam shot her a questioning look, but she just gave him a small, reassuring smile. She pulled a $10 bill from her tips jar, money she had earned one cup at a time, one gentle word at a time, and slipped it into the register with a practiced motion. "Ben," she called to the kitchen, her voice low but steady, "can you make me a sandwich and a bowl of tomato soup? Extra hot." Ben, a burly man with a face softened by years of kitchen heat and laughter, raised an eyebrow but didn't question her. He had worked with Ella long enough to know that when she asked for something, it mattered. "Coming right up," he grunted, and the sizzle of the griddle took over. Ella poured a cup of black coffee, adding a splash of cream and a dusting of cinnamon, the the way her grandmother had taught her long ago. She placed it on a small tray with a folded napkin and a kindness that didn't need permission. As she walked back to the table, she felt the weight of Harvey Thompson's gaze from across the room. Harvey, the manager with a clipboard for a heart, who measured everything in profit margins and minutes wasted. He watched her with an expression that said he had already counted the cost of every kindness she offered. Ella placed the tray in front of the old man, who looked up at her with eyes that glistened like the wet streets outside. "Thank you," he murmured, the words soft as a prayer. She smiled, a small, steady thing that said she saw him, really saw him. In that moment, the storm outside seemed to pause, the clouds holding their breath, the city listening. Ella didn't know then how quickly the world could turn, how a single act of decency could ripple outwards until it shook the very walls around her. All she knew was that for one moment, she had chosen to be kind, and that was enough. The rain outside had settled into a quiet drizzle by the time Ella stepped back behind the counter, her mind already bracing for what she knew was coming. Harvey Thompson stood there, arms folded across his chest, like a general inspecting his troops, his narrow eyes locked on her every move. The cafe around them carried on in its usual symphony, milk steamers hissing, plates clinking, the low hum of conversation. But for Ella, each sound felt sharper, more brittle, as if the air itself was waiting for the confrontation to erupt. Sam hovered nervously near the register, his fingers drumming an anxious rhythm against the wooden surface. But Ella kept her expression calm, steady as the drizzle outside. She had learned long ago that panic was a luxury she couldn't afford. Harvey's voice cut through the murmur of the cafe, low and sharp like the first crack of thunder. "Ella," he said, his tone deceptively smooth, "we have rules here, you know that." She didn't flinch. "I paid for it myself, Harvey. No one else is covering that meal but me." He cocked his head, a smile that didn't reach his eyes flickering across his face. "And what if every employee decided to start handing out charity on their shifts? This is a business, not a soup kitchen." The word stung, but Ella didn't let it show. "He looked like he needed it," she said simply. Around them, customers began to take notice. Forks paused halfway to mouths, conversation stalling in mid-sentence. The cafe's cozy warmth suddenly felt like a stage, every eye a spotlight. Harvey stepped closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper meant to intimidate. "You think your small kindness justifies ignoring my policies?" Ella swallowed, her hands resting on the edge of the counter, knuckles white. "It's not about policies. It's about doing the right thing." For a moment, Harvey said nothing. The silence stretched, heavy and oppressive, before he finally straightened up and turned to the room. "Attention, everyone," he called out, his voice rising above the quiet clatter of dishes. "Just so you all know, our employee here has decided she can give away food whenever she sees fit. If anyone else is looking for a handout, feel free to line up. Apparently, she's paying." A ripple of discomfort swept through the cafe. A young couple exchanged glances, a man in a corner booth frowned, the toddler in the back let out a sharp cry that seemed to echo the sudden chill in the air. Ella felt her face flush with heat, not from shame, but from the raw injustice of it. She opened her mouth to protest, but before she could speak, Harvey's voice cut her off. "You're done, Ella," he said, his tone final, absolute. "Turn in your apron and leave, now." Sam's eyes widened, his lips parting in shock, but he said nothing. Ben poked his head out from the kitchen, his brow furrowed in confusion, but he didn't step forward. The old man, Mr. Raymond Cole, watched it all from his booth, his frail hands wrapped around the mug of coffee, eyes shadowed with something deeper than confusion. He rose slowly, the movement of a man used to carrying weight no one else could see. "She did nothing wrong," he said, his voice hoarse but resolute. "I didn't mean to cause trouble." Harvey didn't even look at him. "Sit down, sir. This doesn't concern you." But Mr. Cole didn't sit. Instead, he reached into the inner pocket of his coat and pulled out a small velvet box, worn at the edges, the clasp barely holding together. He opened it with trembling fingers to reveal the Purple Heart medal nestled inside, its silver and purple gleam catching the light. The room seemed to inhale all at once, the medal like a sudden sunbeam in the muted cafe. "This," Mr. Cole said softly, "was given to me for wounds I took in a land far from here, for friends I lost, for promises I made." She honored that, in a way most people have forgotten. Harvey's face tightened, a flicker of uncertainty passing over his features. But he recovered quickly, his mouth twisting into a sneer. "We're not talking about medals, we're talking about a business and a paycheck." But Mr. Cole's eyes, cloudy but unwavering, met Ella's, and he placed the medal gently on the table. "They'll come," he murmured, so quietly Ella almost didn't hear. "They always do." Ella didn't know what he meant, but the way he said it sent a shiver down her spine, as if the walls themselves were listening. She untied her apron, folding it slowly, carefully, as if it were a shroud for something more than a job. Around her, the cafe held its breath, the weight of every unspoken word pressing down. She didn't cry. She wouldn't give Harvey that satisfaction, but her hands shook as she set the apron on the counter. Ben emerged from the kitchen, wiping his hands on his apron, his face unreadable. Sam took a step forward, then stopped, his mouth opening and closing like he wanted to say something but didn't know how. Ella turned to Mr. Cole, her voice a whisper of apology and gratitude all at once. "Thank you," she said, "but you don't have to stand up for me." The old man just nodded, his eyes softening. "Some things," he said, "are worth standing up for." And with that, she walked out into the rain, the bell above the door chiming once, twice, 3 times behind her, each note a quiet farewell to the place she had called home. The world outside was gray and wet, the mist soft against her skin, but in her chest, a small flame of defiance burned bright and unyielding. She didn't know what would come next, didn't know if the world would remember this moment, or if it would fade like so many others, but she knew one thing for certain. She would not let kindness be something that needed permission. Not today. Not ever. The rain had turned into a soft mist by the time Ella stepped out onto the cobblestone sidewalk, her breath visible in the cool morning air, each exhale a small cloud that dissolved into the quiet world around her. She stood there for a moment, her apron still folded neatly in her hands, like a keepsake from a life she hadn't realized she was leaving behind. The Elm Tree Café glowed warm behind her, its windows steamed with the breath of a dozen conversations, but she felt no warmth in that glow now, only the hollow echo of what had been lost. She could hear Harvey's voice even through the glass, a brittle laugh that didn't belong to someone who understood kindness, and she turned away from it, stepping off the curb and onto the street without really seeing where she was going. The drizzle clung to her hair and lashes, but she didn't lift her hood. She let it wash over her like a quiet baptism, a cleansing of all the moments she had swallowed down her own voice in the name of keeping her job, of keeping the peace. She had never expected gratitude for a sandwich, never wanted applause for a cup of coffee, but the way Harvey had twisted her act of compassion into an offense, a threat, had cut deeper than she'd imagined it would. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, but she ignored it, the weight of the morning pressing against her shoulders like a wet coat. She kept walking until the cafe was just a memory behind her, the chatter of tourists and the clink of dishes fading into the distance. Around her, Savannah moved at its own pace, bicycles weaving through puddles, the distant wail of a saxophone from a street corner, the hush of the river beyond the square. She passed a bookstore she had always meant to visit, its windows fogged with the promise of other worlds, and for a moment she let herself imagine a different life, one where she could have stayed behind that counter, pouring lattes and offering small kindnesses without fear of reprisal, one where a man like Harvey didn't hold the power to define right and wrong. But the world wasn't built that way, and she knew it. She found a bench in a quiet park, a place where the oaks reached down like ancient guardians, and she sat there, the wood cold beneath her, the rain a gentle drumbeat on the leaves above. She watched as the world went about its business, as if nothing had changed, but in her chest, something had shifted irrevocably. She thought of Mr. Raymond Cole, of the way he had looked at her with eyes that seemed to see more than the room around them. "They'll come," he had said. And though she didn't know who they were, she felt the weight of that promise settle around her shoulders like a cloak. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the memory of his voice steady her racing thoughts. He had spoken with a certainty that made her wonder if there were still places in the world where kindness wasn't something to be punished, but something to be cherished, something to be defended. The thought was both a comfort and a challenge. She didn't know how long she sat there, her hands curled around the soft cotton of her apron, her thoughts chasing each other in endless circles. Eventually, the soft creak of footsteps on the wet path drew her eyes up. Sam stood there, his hair plastered to his forehead, his breath hitching in the cool air. "Ella," he said, his voice low, unsure. I didn't say anything. I should have." She gave him a small, tired smile. "You don't owe me that, Sam." He shook his head, his shoulders slumping. "But I wanted to. I wanted to tell him he was wrong, that you were the best part of that place." She looked at him, really looked, and saw the same conflict in his eyes that she felt in her own chest. "It's okay," she said softly. "Sometimes it's enough to know you would have." He looked down, his fingers twisting the hem of his sleeve. "I don't know if I can go back in there. Not after what he did." She reached out, laying a hand on his arm, the touch light but steady. "Then don't," she said. "You don't have to stay somewhere that doesn't see you." His eyes met hers, and for a moment, the rain and the cold didn't matter. He nodded once, a quiet understanding passing between them. "I'm sorry," he said again, and she knew he meant it. She watched him walk away, his shoulders squared against the drizzle, and she let out a slow breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. She knew she couldn't sit there forever. The world wouldn't pause for her heartbreak, and besides, she had never been the type to let herself drown in what couldn't be changed. She stood, tucking her apron into her bag, and started back down the path, her steps slow but certain. She didn't know what waited for her at the end of the block or the next, but she knew she wouldn't carry the shame of that morning with her. She had done something good, something human, and no one could take that from her. As she turned the corner onto a narrow street lined with small shops and cafes, she saw the reflection of the Elm Tree Café in a window across the road. Inside, Harvey moved like a man rearranging furniture on a sinking ship, his hands tight around a stack of receipts, his mouth pressed into a thin line. Customers watched him with guarded eyes, their conversations hushed, their glances flickering to the door as if they were waiting for something, or someone. Ella didn't stop. She didn't need to see how that story would end. Instead, she let the rain carry her forward, each drop a quiet promise that this moment wouldn't define her. In the distance, the slow roar of the river reached her ears, a lullaby for the brave and the broken. And somewhere in that quiet song, she found the strength to keep moving. The rain turned into a steady, whispering sheet of silver that misted the windows of every small shop Ella passed, softening the edges of the city and making the cobblestones glisten under the dim light of the street lamps that had flickered to life early against the stubborn gray of the sky. And as she walked, she could feel the weight of each breath she took, the tight ache in her chest that came from swallowing down everything she'd wanted to say to Harvey but had left unspoken. Everything she'd wanted to shout into the silence of that cafe but hadn't, because some part of her still clung to the fragile hope that doing the right thing didn't always have to come with a price. But now she knew better, knew that sometimes it did, and sometimes that price was paid in the currency of your own quiet dignity, paid out in the hush that followed the closing of a door behind you, in the cold that seeped in when you no longer belonged to the warmth inside. But she didn't regret it. Not really. Not when she thought of the look in Mr. Cole's eyes as he had watched her leave. Not when she remembered the careful way he had placed that medal on the table, like an offering to something larger than the rules that Harvey clung to like a drowning man. And she carried that memory with her as she stepped into the small bus shelter at the corner of Broad Street and Liberty, her hair dripping cold down her back and her hands red from the chill, the steady roar of tires on wet pavement, a lullaby that seemed to echo the slow, uncertain beat of her own heart. She sank down onto the worn wooden bench, the smell of rain and exhaust heavy in the air, and for a moment she let her head fall into her hands, letting herself feel the sting of it all, the raw burn of standing up and being pushed back down, of giving and being told it was wrong. But even as her eyes burned, no tears came, because she was too tired to cry, too used to the quiet ways the world could cut you down without ever raising its voice. And so she just breathed. The rhythm of her own pulse, a reminder that she was still here, still whole, even if the world around her didn't care to notice. The minutes slipped by, each one as soft and heavy as the next, and she watched the rain blur the headlights of passing cars into long smears of white and red, a watercolor of motion that seemed to belong to another life, one she could watch but never touch. And then the door of a sleek black SUV parked across the street swung open, the sound of it lost under the hush of the rain, but the motion as precise and deliberate as a blade unsheathed, and she watched as 4 men stepped out, their silhouettes broad and sure against the gloom, each one wearing the dark dress blues of the United States Navy, their posture as crisp as their uniforms. The quiet authority of men who had learned the language of respect in places where it was paid for in blood and bone. And as they crossed the street, the world seemed to lean in around them, the rain parting in rivulets off the brims of their caps, their boots moving in perfect unison over the wet stones. And Ella felt her breath catch, something deep in her chest stirring at the sight of them. Not fear, but a kind of awe, a kind of relief that she hadn't realized she'd been craving until that moment. They didn't glance around or hesitate as they reached the door of the Elm Tree Café, and with one measured push, the door swung open and swallowed them whole, the bell above the door ringing out once, twice, 3 times, each chime a soft drumbeat that echoed back across the street to where Ella sat frozen, her hands clenched in her lap, the rain forgotten, and even from here she could feel the shift in the air, could sense the sudden stillness inside that cafe she had once called home, like the whole room was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. She pressed her palms against the cold glass of the bus shelter, leaning forward to watch, her heart beating faster than it had all morning, because she didn't know these men. Not really, but she knew who they were, what they represented, and she knew that whatever Harvey thought he could control was about to slip through his fingers like the rain itself. The seconds stretched out, each one a held breath, a silent prayer, and then the door swung open again and she saw them. The 4 men stepping back out into the rain, but not alone. Behind them walked Mr. Cole, his thin shoulders held straight, his chin lifted like a man who had remembered who he was. And for a heartbeat, their eyes met across the street, his and hers, and in that moment, she saw something in him that made her sit up straighter. Something that looked like peace, like the quiet certainty that he was no longer alone. She rose from the bench, her legs trembling, her breath catching in her throat as the 4 Navy veterans and Mr. Cole crossed the street, their steps unhurried but sure, and as they drew near, she could see the way their eyes softened when they looked at her, the way they seemed to carry the weight of 1,000 stories in the lines of their faces. And when they reached her, the tallest of them, a man with eyes the color of storm clouds and a scar that curved like a question across his cheek, nodded once, a gesture that said more than any words could have. And then Mr. Cole stepped forward, his hand lifting in a small, careful wave. "Ella," he said, his voice as rough as gravel, but warm with something that felt like gratitude. "I told you they'd come." And she nodded, her throat too tight for words, her heart pounding with the knowledge that sometimes, when you chose to do the right thing, you didn't stand alone. Not really, not when there were still those in the world who remembered what it meant to stand for something larger than themselves. The moment felt suspended in time as Ella stood there, the rain cascading down her shoulders in shimmering curtains, her breath catching as she took in the sight of Mr. Cole and the 4 Navy veterans who flanked him like sentinels of a forgotten code, their uniforms dark against the wet street, but brighter somehow than any neon sign or flickering cafe light behind them. And though she could not name it, she felt in that instant a current of something old and noble moving through the mist between them, a silent understanding that her small act of kindness had set something in motion that reached far beyond a single cup of coffee or a bowl of soup. "I didn't expect," she began, her voice breaking under the weight of the words she could barely find. "But, Mr." Cole shook his head, his thin lips pulling into a soft, patient smile. "You didn't have to," he said, and in those 4 words was a lifetime of battles fought and friendships forged in the fire of shared purpose. She felt the gravity of it settle into her chest, a warmth that pushed back the chill of the rain as she realized these men weren't here to return a favor, but to honor a debt deeper than any rule book could ever bind. The tallest of the veterans, whose name she would later learn, was Reuben Cole, a distant cousin of Mr. Cole, who had spent decades serving in the Navy and had the quiet, unflinching presence of a man who had seen the best and worst of human nature, stepped closer then, his boots sending up tiny splashes from the puddles at his feet. "Ma'am," he said, his voice low and steady, "we heard what happened inside that cafe, and we're not here to cause trouble. But we are here to make sure you know you weren't wrong." His eyes, dark and solemn, held hers with an intensity that made her straighten her shoulders, her damp hair clinging to her cheeks. "Harvey tried to humiliate you for showing compassion, but you should know that there are still those of us who believe compassion is never something to be ashamed of." She felt her lips part, a small, involuntary breath catching as she took in the calm power of his words. The way he spoke with a kind of certainty that left no room for doubt. The second man, broader and with a kindness in his eyes that belied the hard lines of his jaw, nodded in agreement. "We've all been where Mr. Cole was today," he said softly, "sitting alone, wondering if anyone saw us as more than a burden, and you reminded us that there are still people who see past the uniform, past the years, and see the man inside." Ella swallowed hard, her hands clenched at her sides, as the enormity of what they were saying sank in. Behind them, the door of the Elm Tree Café creaked open once more, and she saw Harvey standing there, framed in the doorway like a man out of place in his own domain. His face pale and tight, his eyes flickering from the veterans to Ella and back again, a thousand unspoken fears dancing behind his practiced calm. Reuben turned his head slightly, his voice never rising above that quiet certainty. "We're not here to disrupt your business, sir," he said, addressing Harvey without an ounce of deference. "But we are here to say this. What you did today, how you treated her, that doesn't go unnoticed." Harvey's mouth opened and closed, the words he wanted to wield like a shield catching in his throat, as the third veteran, older and with silver at his temples, spoke up. "This isn't about a free meal," he said, his tone carrying the weight of 1,000 miles traveled and 1,000 nights spent awake under foreign stars. "It's about the principle of it, about whether we're the kind of people who turn away from a hungry man, or the kind who say, 'Here, eat, and know you're welcome.'" The silence that followed was louder than any shout, a silence filled with the soft patter of rain and the low hum of the city beyond. Ella felt her chest tighten, her heart thudding with a strange mixture of fear and fierce rising pride. She saw in Harvey's eyes the struggle to hold on to his control, the way he squared his shoulders as if he could will the moment to pass. But the fourth veteran, a quiet man with a scar across his brow that seemed to glow silver in the wet light, stepped forward and with a calm, measured voice said, "We didn't come here to argue, Mr. Thompson. We came here to remind you that kindness is never wasted." And that simple statement, spoken without anger or accusation, struck something deep in the hearts of everyone who could hear. Ella saw customers inside the cafe, people she had served countless times, turning their heads, their eyes meeting hers across the wet glass. And in those glances, she saw something she hadn't dared to hope for: understanding, respect, maybe even the seeds of a quiet revolt against the way things had always been. She took a breath then, her voice steady, though her hands still shook. "I didn't do it for recognition," she said, her tone quiet but unyielding. "I did it because it was the right thing to do." Reuben nodded once, his lips lifting in a faint, approving smile. "And that's what matters," he said, his words as certain as the steady beat of the rain, as enduring as the quiet dignity of the old man who had sat alone in that booth until she had seen him, really seen him. That's what always matters. Inside the Elm Tree Café, the warm air smelled faintly of roasted beans and baked bread, but the room felt colder than the rain outside, as Harvey Thompson stood just behind the register, his face pale beneath the overhead light, eyes flicking nervously from the four veterans to the staff and the customers who had grown still and silent, the usual comfort of clinking mugs and soft conversation, replaced by a quiet so heavy it felt like another weight on his chest. He tried to hold on to the confidence that had carried him through years of running this place like a tight ship, but that confidence was slipping through his fingers like wet sand. "Listen," he began, his voice hoarse and forced into a tone of calm that felt brittle. "This is a business. I have to think about my bottom line, about what it costs to let people give away food whenever they feel like it." His words seemed to hang in the air, but they landed flat, as if even he knew how empty they were, because no one moved. No one spoke to back him up. Even Sam stood frozen by the pastry case, his eyes locked on Ella through the window. Reuben Cole didn't raise his voice or break the steady calm of his presence, but his next words cut through the room like a blade. "You think this is about money?" he said, each syllable precise. "It's not about a sandwich or a bowl of soup. It's about whether you understand what it means to care for another human being." Harvey's jaw twitched, a muscle jumping along his cheek as he swallowed hard. "You're making this bigger than it is," he muttered, but the second veteran, the one with the easy kindness in his eyes, shook his head slowly. "No, sir," he said, "we're not making this bigger. You did that the moment you decided that following a policy was more important than showing a man he still matters." His voice was quiet, but in that quiet there was something that resonated with everyone who heard it. A note of truth that couldn't be denied. Harvey's shoulders slumped just a fraction, his eyes darting to the door as if he might bolt out into the rain himself. But he stayed rooted to the floor, his knuckles white against the edge of the register. Ella watched through the window, her heart thudding like a slow drum in her chest, as the third veteran, older and with that silver at his temples, took a step forward. "I spent years overseas," he said, his voice low and steady. "I've seen men break because they thought no one cared if they came back, and I've seen them heal because of a single act of kindness, a single reminder that they weren't alone." His gaze was level and unwavering as he met Harvey's eyes. "That's what she did today." Harvey opened his mouth again, the words catching in his throat. "She broke the rules," he tried, but it sounded small, a child's protest in the face of something older and truer. And the fourth veteran, the quiet one with the scar that shone like a question mark, let out a slow breath and said, "Sometimes, sir, rules are nothing more than lines on a page, and decency is what lives between those lines." In the corner of the cafe, a young woman with a sleeping baby in her arms shifted in her seat, her eyes bright with unshed tears. The man in the booth by the window, who had once scowled when his coffee was a minute late, was nodding slowly, as if he'd been waiting his whole life for someone to say exactly that. Behind the counter, Ben the cook stepped forward, his big hands still dusted with flour. "I've worked in this kitchen for 5 years," he said, his voice gravelly but calm. "And I've watched Ella pour her heart into every single cup she's handed out. She's never once complained about the hours or the cold or the way you speak to her, Harvey. And you think firing her was about a $10 meal? It was about the fact that she reminded all of us of what it means to be human." A hush settled over the room as he spoke, each word landing with the weight of something real, something that had been buried too long. Harvey's face went red, his mouth opening like he was about to bark orders again, but nothing came out. Because in that moment, he knew, and they all knew, that the power he had once wielded so easily was gone. Taken back by the quiet voices of those who refused to let him dictate the boundaries of compassion, Ella stood outside, her breath fogging the glass as she watched it unfold, the rain drumming a quiet applause on the roof of the bus shelter above her. And in the reflection of the window, she saw herself not as the girl who had been shamed for caring, but as the woman who had stood her ground in the face of that shame. And she realized that whatever happened next, she'd already won something that no one could take away, because the truth was standing there in that cafe, in the soft strength of the men who had come for Mr. Cole, in the steady voices of her friends who had found the courage to speak up. And she knew in her bones that it wasn't just about her anymore. It was about every small act of kindness that had ever been dismissed or mocked. Every time someone had been told that decency was a liability instead of a light. And as she turned away from the glass, her head held high and her heart steady, she whispered to herself, "Let them see." And she knew they would. The air in the Elm Tree Café felt heavy, as if every word and every breath had settled into the wooden beams of the ceiling and the grooves of the floorboards, each echo a silent witness to what was unfolding. And Ella stood outside in the soft mist, her fingers pressed lightly against the glass, feeling the thrum of her own heartbeat in the cold, as she watched Harvey's face twist and contort, each flicker of his expression betraying the slow collapse of the certainty he had once worn. Like armor, inside, the youngest of the 4 veterans, his hair just beginning to silver at the temples, and his posture straight as a flagpole, took a slow breath and said, "You fired her like she was a problem you needed to fix, but she was the reason half the people in this room came back day after day." His voice was calm, each word deliberate, and though it wasn't loud, it carried in that hush like a ripple in still water. Customers shifted in their seats, their eyes locked on Harvey, and even those who had been quiet until now began to find their voices. A woman with dark curls and tired eyes stood up from her seat near the back, her voice trembling but clear. "I come in every morning, and she always remembers my name, my usual drink, even the days when I'm too tired to smile. She makes me feel seen," she said, her hand tightening around the strap of her worn leather bag, and her words seemed to light something in the air, like the first spark that finds dry kindling. A man at the window, an older gentleman with a weathered face and hands that had seen decades of labor, cleared his throat. "My wife passed 3 years ago," he said, his voice rough with memory, And Ella, she never pried, never pushed, just gave me my coffee and a kind word every morning, and it mattered. His last words fell into the quiet like pebbles into deep water, and in that moment, it was as if the whole room leaned into that quiet, everyone listening, everyone feeling the weight of what kindness meant. Harvey's lips moved, but no words came out, and behind him, Sam stood with his shoulders squared, his face pale but resolute. She walked me to my car every night when it was dark, made sure I got home safe because she knew I was just trying to pay for school and didn't want to tell my parents how hard it was, he said, his voice breaking on the last word, and the cook, Ben, stepped closer to the counter, his big hands braced on the wood. "We've all seen how you run this place, Harvey," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "But she's the one who kept it alive, not your rules or your orders, her." In the window's reflection, Ella watched the truth of it ripple through the room, each confession a small stone of honesty in a world that too often looked away. She felt the warmth of their words in her chest, a fragile but fierce glow that made the rain feel less cold, and she realized that maybe this was what it meant to really matter. Not to be praised or noticed, but to be a part of the small moments that stitched people's days together, the moments no one else saw. Harvey's face went slack, his eyes wide with something that looked almost like fear. And for a heartbeat, he looked like a man who had finally understood how small he was in the face of what he had tried to snuff out. "I don't have to explain myself to any of you," he said, but his voice cracked under the weight of his own defense. And the third veteran, the one with the calm gaze and the slow, patient way of speaking, shook his head. "Maybe you don't," he said softly, "but someday you'll have to explain it to yourself." The words settled in the air, final and heavy, and Harvey looked away, his eyes darting from face to face, finding no refuge in the room he thought he owned. Ella stepped back from the window then, her breath fogging the glass one last time before she turned away, the cold air biting at her cheeks as she stepped onto the wet sidewalk. She felt the weight of everything that had happened settle into her bones. But it was not a weight she wanted to shed, because it was the weight of her own choice, her own voice. And it was hers to carry, across the street, the black SUV still idled, the 4 veterans now standing in the rain like sentinels, their uniforms damp but their eyes steady. Reuben met her gaze, his nod slow and deliberate. And in that nod was a promise that what she had done mattered, that it would not be forgotten. And as the rain fell around them in silver sheets, Ella realized that no matter how small her act had felt in the moment, it had cracked open a space for something bigger than any rule or any paycheck, something that would live on in the quiet strength of every voice that had just found the courage to speak. Ella stood on the curb, the cold seeping through her soaked sneakers, and the rain turning the world into a blur of shimmering reflections that pooled in the cracks of the old cobblestone street. But in her chest, she felt a steadiness that no downpour could wash away, a quiet certainty that she had done the right thing, even if it had cost her everything she'd built inside that cafe. She watched as the 4 veterans turned back toward the door of the elm tree, their shoulders squared, their steps measured, and she knew in that moment that the weight of what she'd done didn't rest on her alone. It was carried by every man who had ever worn those uniforms, every story etched in the lines of their faces, and the way they held themselves, with a dignity that had nothing to do with medals or orders. She drew in a slow breath, the mist cool in her lungs, and stepped back from the street just as the door swung open again, the bell's soft chime cutting through the hush like a single, clear note of defiance. Inside, Harvey looked smaller than she'd ever seen him, his shoulders hunched and his face pale under the harsh glow of the overhead lights. Sam was there too, his expression tight but resolute. And beside him, Ben with his arms crossed over his chest like a silent wall of quiet rebellion. And she saw in that moment how the balance of power had shifted, how Harvey's authority had always been an illusion, propped up by fear and silence, and how once that silence was broken, there was no going back. The oldest veteran stepped forward, his hair silver under the flickering light, and in his hand he held the Purple Heart, that mister Cole had left behind, its ribbon dark with rain but still gleaming like a promise. He placed it carefully on the counter, his gaze level as he met Harvey's eyes. "This," he said, his voice low and even, "isn't just a medal. It's a reminder that we don't leave each other behind." His words were soft, but carried a gravity that filled the room, and Harvey's mouth opened. closed, his hands flexing uselessly at his sides. Outside, Ella pressed her hand to the cold glass, her breath fogging the window as she watched. And in that moment, she didn't see herself as the girl who had been fired for caring too much, but as the woman who had started something she couldn't have foreseen, something that rippled out beyond the doors of that small cafe and into the hearts of everyone who had witnessed it. The second veteran, younger and with a quiet kindness in his eyes, stepped up beside the first, his voice calm and measured. "We're not here to take over your cafe, mister Thompson," he said. "We're here to remind you that decency isn't something you get to ration out. It's the foundation of everything worth keeping." The silence that followed was deeper than any shout, the kind of silence that said everything without a single word. And in that stillness, the woman with the baby in the back of the room shifted, her eyes bright as she looked at Harvey. "You fired her for being decent," she said, her voice trembling but clear. "And that tells me everything I need to know about you." Around her, others nodded, the small gestures of agreement building like a slow, unstoppable tide, and Harvey's shoulders sagged under the weight of it, his face paling as he looked from one face to another and saw nothing but quiet condemnation staring back. The fourth veteran, the one with the scar that caught the light every time he turned his head, let out a slow breath and said, "You've spent years making sure no one questioned you. But today we're not questioning. We're remembering who we are and what matters." And Ella felt those words settle into her bones like an anchor, steadying her even as her hands shook. She knew then that this wasn't just about her job, or even about Harvey's petty cruelty. It was about the simple, stubborn power of standing up and saying, "Enough." About how even the smallest act of kindness could crack open a space for truth to come pouring through. She watched as the veterans turned away from the counter, their shoulders straight and their steps calm. And as they reached the door, Reuben paused, turning back to Harvey, with a final, quiet look. "You fired the wrong person," he said softly, and there was no anger in his voice, only a deep, unwavering certainty that rang louder than any shout could have. Then he pushed open the door, and the four of them stepped out into the rain, their silhouettes sharp against the gray world beyond. Ella felt her breath catch as Mr. Cole followed them, his steps slower but no less steady, his head held high and his eyes clear in a way she hadn't seen before. And as he passed her, he gave her a small, quiet nod, a gesture that said everything she needed to hear. She watched them walk down the street, the rain softening the sound of their boots on the pavement. And in that moment, she knew that what she had done would echo far beyond the walls of that cafe, a quiet testament to the fact that even the smallest acts of kindness could leave ripples that reached farther than she could ever see. And as she turned away, her heart steady in her chest, she whispered to herself, "This isn't the end," because she knew it wasn't. It was just the beginning. Ella stood on the sidewalk as the rain turned the street into a river of flickering reflections, each lamppost shimmering in pools of liquid gold and silver, and she watched the four veterans and Mr. Cole vanish around the corner, their steps calm and sure even as the mist swallowed them up, a testament to something that felt both ancient and eternal, and she felt a strange, powerful calm settle in her chest, the kind that comes when you realize you've done something that matters, something that can't be undone or diminished, no matter how small it might have seemed in the moment. She turned back to the Elm Tree Cafe and saw Harvey through the window, his posture rigid and his eyes haunted by something he could no longer hide, behind clipped orders or cold smiles. He looked like a man standing in the ruins of his own kingdom, and she knew in that instant that whatever hold he'd had over this place had been broken. Inside the cafe, the hush had given way to soft murmurs, the kind of low, urgent conversations that ripple out when people realize they've witnessed a turning point and are trying to make sense of it. Sam moved from table to table, his steps hesitant, but his chin lifted a fraction higher than it had been before. And Ben stood behind the counter with his arms crossed, his broad shoulders radiating a quiet defiance that seemed to fill the space. And for the first time, Ella saw the elm tree for what it truly was. A stage where the real power didn't belong to the man who wrote the schedule or counted the money, but to the people who made it feel like home, and she felt something in her chest loosen. Something that had been tight and aching for far too long. She took a breath and stepped back from the window, her fingers trailing across the cool glass, and started down the street, the rain washing the last of her doubt from her skin. She didn't know where she was going yet, only that she couldn't go back inside, not to ask for her job, not to fight for a place that had never seen her worth until she was gone. Her feet carried her past familiar landmarks, the little bookstore with the faded sign, the antique shop with the window display that never seemed to change, and she felt the city open up around her like a map she hadn't realized she'd been tracing for years, every street and square a piece of the story she was finally ready to write for herself. She paused at a crosswalk and caught sight of her reflection in the glass of a darkened shop, her hair damp and her eyes bright. And for the first time, she didn't see the tired barista who had spent too many mornings wiping down tables and swallowing her own voice. She saw a woman who had chosen to act when it mattered, who had paid a price for it but refused to be ashamed. And the sight of that woman, the quiet strength in her shoulders, the calm in her gaze, filled her with a fierce, almost dizzying sense of possibility. The light changed, and she stepped off the curb, the rain still falling steady and soft around her, and she thought of the purple heart that had sat on the counter, of the weight of it in the veteran's hand, and the way it had shone even in the dim light, a symbol of wounds that had healed into something stronger, something that could never be taken away. And she realized that maybe the world was full of those quiet acts of courage, the ones no one saw or celebrated, but that changed everything all the same. She walked on, each step a small declaration that she wouldn't let fear decide what kind of person she would be, not anymore. And as she passed a small cafe she'd never noticed before, its windows fogged with steam and laughter drifting out into the night, she felt the tug of something warm and welcoming, and knew that wherever she ended up, she would carry this day with her, a quiet testament to the truth she'd found in the space between kindness and cruelty. A promise to herself that she would never again let anyone tell her that caring was weakness. She paused for a moment, her hand resting on the cool, damp brick of the building beside her, and closed her eyes, letting the sound of the rain and the distant echo of voices wash over her. She thought of Mr. Cole and the quiet strength in his eyes, of the veterans who had stood beside him and beside her, and she thought of the soft, unwavering truth that had held her steady through it all. That kindness doesn't need permission, that even the smallest act can be a spark in the dark, and she opened her eyes and stepped forward, ready to see where that spark might lead. The world had shifted by the time Ella reached the bus stop, the rain easing into a soft drizzle that misted the streetlights and turned the city into a watercolor of gold and silver. And she sat there on the edge of the bench with her apron still folded in her lap, her fingers tracing the worn hem as if it were a talisman from a life she was no longer sure she wanted back. She thought of the quiet power that had filled the cafe when those veterans had spoken, the way their voices had cracked something open that could never be closed again. And she felt that same power thrumming beneath her skin, a quiet echo of their strength that made her sit a little taller. Even as the chill of the night crept into her bones, she closed her eyes for a moment and let the soft sound of the rain become a lullaby, the hush of it washing away the last of the fear that had held her back for too long. And when she opened her eyes, she saw that she was no longer alone. Across the street, a man she recognized from the cafe, Charles Fenner, a local contractor known for his quiet generosity and the way he always left a tip twice as large as his coffee order, was striding toward her, his coat dark with rain, but his steps sure. He stopped in front of her, his face serious but kind, and she felt her breath catch in her throat as he spoke. "Ella," he said, his voice low but carrying in the stillness. "I saw what happened today, and I want you to know you didn't just serve a meal, you served dignity." She blinked, the words hitting her like a balm on a raw wound, and she managed a small, tired smile. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice a whisper in the wet night. Charles nodded, his gaze steady. "Listen, I work with the Veterans Outreach Center here in Savannah. We're always looking for people who understand what it means to show up for someone else." He paused, his eyes searching hers. "People like you." Her heart thudded in her chest. The weight of the day suddenly lighter in the face of this unexpected offer, and she found herself nodding, her hands tightening on the apron in her lap. "I'd be honored," she said, her voice trembling but sure, and he smiled, a quiet relief in the lines of his face. "Good," he said, "because we could use someone like you." They exchanged a few more words, simple and true, before he pressed a card into her hand, his thumb brushing over hers in a gesture of quiet reassurance, and then he turned and walked back into the night, leaving her sitting there with the rain falling soft around her and the card warm in her palm. She turned it over, reading the name of the center and the quiet promise it seemed to hold. Haggerty Veterans Outreach Center. Service. Compassion. Respect. And she felt a quiet thrill in her chest. A fragile but fierce hope that maybe this was the place she was meant to be. Not behind a counter serving lattes to people who barely looked up, but somewhere her kindness could take root and grow. She tucked the card carefully into her pocket and stood, the rain easing into mist, as she started down the street. Her footsteps light despite the exhaustion in her bones, she walked past the empty cafe and didn't look back, because she knew that place would never hold her future again. And as she turned the corner, she let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. A breath that tasted like rain and freedom and the quiet certainty that she was exactly where she needed to be. The city stretched out before her, each puddle reflecting the soft glow of the streetlights, each breath of mist a promise of new beginnings, and she walked into it with her head high, her heart steady, and a quiet prayer on her lips that whatever came next, she would meet it with the same quiet courage that had brought her here. And in that moment, she knew. She was ready. The next morning dawned with a soft light that pushed through the thinning clouds and turned the city into a gentle tapestry of gold and pewter. And Ella woke in her small apartment to the quiet rhythm of raindrops against the window and the steady calm of her own breath. She dressed in jeans and a sweater that smelled faintly of coffee and cinnamon, her fingers pausing for a moment on the folded apron still resting on the chair by her bed, a relic of a chapter that felt at once finished and unfinished. And as she tucked it away in a drawer, she let the finality of that simple act settle into her bones. Outside, the world felt new and familiar all at once, the damp air carrying the scent of wet leaves and something sweeter. Maybe it was hope, she thought, as she walked toward the Haggerty Veterans Outreach Center, the small white building tucked between an old brick laundromat and a corner store with a flickering neon sign. She paused at the door for a moment, her heart fluttering in her chest like a bird testing its wings. And then she stepped inside, the warm air smelling of coffee and faintly of lemon-scented cleaner, the walls lined with photos of veterans and volunteers, each one a small testament to the quiet dignity of service. A woman at the front desk looked up, her smile warm and genuine. "You must be Ella," she said, her voice as steady as the morning light. "We've been expecting you." Ella nodded, her throat tight but her smile sure. "I'm ready," she said, and the woman, whose name tag read Monica, just nodded. As if she'd known that all along, Monica led her down a narrow hallway lined with framed photographs, the kind of images that told stories without words. A soldier's handshake, a shared meal, the laughter in the eyes of people who had found safe harbor after too many storms. Ella felt each one settle into her, a quiet weight that felt right, like something she had been carrying all along without realizing it. Monica paused outside a small office, the door slightly ajar, and gave her a reassuring pat on the arm. "Go on in," she said. "Jordan's been looking forward to meeting you." Ella took a slow breath and pushed the door open. Inside, Jordan Malik sat behind a battered oak desk, his posture relaxed, but his eyes sharp with the kind of warmth that didn't need words to be understood. He rose as she entered, extending a hand that was calloused but steady. "Ella," he said, his voice calm and grounding. "I've heard a lot about you." She took his hand, her grip firm even though her fingers still trembled. "I didn't expect," she began, but he shook his head, cutting her off with a quiet smile. "No one ever does," he said, his tone as gentle as it was unyielding. "You did what was right, and that matters here." She felt her shoulders ease, the last of the tension from yesterday slowly melting away. And as she sat down in the chair across from him, she felt something settle in her chest, a quiet peace she hadn't known she'd been searching for. They talked for a while, the conversation easy and real, Jordan asking about her work at the Elm Tree, about what she wanted to find here, and she answered honestly, her words simple but true. "I just want to be somewhere where kindness isn't something you have to apologize for," she said finally, her voice steady, even though her hands still trembled in her lap. Jordan nodded, his eyes kind. "You're in the right place, Ella," he said. "Here, we see kindness as strength, not weakness." And she believed him, because the walls of this small room held the weight of too many stories not to be true. He told her about the work they did, connecting veterans with housing, with food, with the simple dignity of being seen and heard. And with each word, she felt the world shift just a little more, opening up a path she hadn't dared to imagine. When she left the office, Monica was waiting with a mug of coffee and a quiet smile, and as she took that first sip, she felt something warm settle deep in her chest. A slow, certain fire that told her she was exactly where she needed to be. She spent the rest of the morning learning the rhythms of the center, the quiet murmur of conversations in the lobby, the rustle of paperwork that was more than just forms. It was the work of rebuilding lives one careful word at a time. She watched as an elderly man with a limp was greeted like an old friend, as a young woman in fatigues was given a warm meal and a seat by the window, and in each small kindness she saw the quiet power of what this place offered. And in the soft light of the afternoon, as the rain finally eased into nothing more than a memory on the windows, she realized that this was what she had been searching for. Not a job, not even a second chance, but a place where her small acts of kindness could find a home. And as she stood there, the scent of coffee and lemon cleaner in the air and the quiet hum of voices all around her, she felt a smile bloom on her lips, a smile that was all her own, and she whispered to herself, "This is where I begin again." The rain had finally lifted by the time Ella left the Haggerty Veterans Outreach Center that evening, the soft glow of the street lamps reflecting off the wet pavement in long streaks of gold that stretched ahead of her like a promise. She stepped out into the cool night air, her breath a slow, steady rhythm that matched the quiet peace settling into her bones. And as she walked down the familiar streets of Savannah, she felt the city itself had shifted, the echoes of what had happened in the Elm Tree Café still humming in the corners of every conversation, every glance that lingered a moment too long. She could see it in the way people paused outside the cafe's darkened windows, their reflections caught in the glass like questions they were just beginning to find the courage to ask, and she felt it in her own steps, the way her feet moved forward with a certainty she hadn't known she'd been missing. Her phone buzzed in her pocket and she pulled it out, the screen lighting up with a message from Sam, just 2 words that said everything she needed to hear. "Thank you," she smiled, her fingers lingering over the keys before she typed back, "You're welcome." And in that brief exchange, she felt the quiet power of connection, of knowing that even small acts of kindness can ripple outward in ways you can't always see. She slipped her phone back into her pocket and kept walking, the night air cool against her cheeks and the quiet song of the city rising around her. She thought of Mr. Cole and the quiet dignity in his eyes, the way he had held that purple heart in his weathered hands, like a promise to every man he'd ever served beside. And she knew that what she had done had mattered, not just to him, but to every quiet, tired soul who had ever wondered if decency still had a place in the world. She turned a corner and paused, her gaze caught by the small coffee shop that had once been just another stop on her daily routine, its windows dark now, the sign in the window flipped to closed. And she wondered if Harvey was inside, alone in the silence he had built around himself. She felt a pang of something she couldn't quite name, pity maybe, or the quiet sadness of seeing someone who had chosen fear over kindness, power over compassion. She didn't linger there, though, because she knew the future didn't wait in the shadows of what had been. It waited in the soft glow of what she was building now. She crossed the street and let the rhythm of her steps guide her forward, each footfall a quiet declaration that she would not let the weight of someone else's fear decide who she was meant to be. She reached her apartment and let herself in, the small space warm and welcoming in a way she had never fully appreciated before. She set her keys on the table and sank into the worn armchair by the window, her eyes tracing the lights of the city outside, and she let herself breathe, really breathe. For the first time in what felt like days, she thought of the veterans who had come to stand with Mr. Cole, of the quiet strength in their voices, and the way they had carried the weight of that day without ever letting it crush them, and she realized that maybe that was what courage really looked like. Not the loud, showy kind that demanded attention, but the soft, unwavering kind that showed up when it mattered and didn't ask for anything in return. She felt that same courage in her own chest, a steady warmth that reminded her that even when the world tried to tell her she was small, her kindness was never wasted. She leaned back in the chair and closed her eyes, the hum of the city outside a quiet lullaby that wrapped around her like a promise, and in that soft, steady heartbeat of the night, she let herself believe that this was just the beginning, that every cup of coffee she had ever poured, every quiet word of comfort she had ever offered, had led her here, to this moment of quiet triumph and fierce, gentle hope, and she whispered to herself, a promise to the girl she had been and the woman she was becoming, I see you, because she did. She saw herself not as someone who had been fired for caring too much, but as someone who had refused to let that caring be a weakness. And as she drifted off to sleep, the rain finally gone and the night wrapped around her like a soft quilt, she knew that tomorrow would come with its own challenges, its own questions, but she would meet them all the same way she had met this one, with the quiet, unwavering courage of someone who understood that kindness was never something to be ashamed of. The next morning dawned bright and clear, the air fresh and washed clean by the night's rain, and as Ella walked to the outreach center, she felt a quiet anticipation humming through her veins, each step a small promise to herself that she would keep moving forward, no matter how small the steps might seem. The city around her was waking up, the early sun turning the wet cobblestones into a mosaic of light and shadow, and she let herself soak in the simple beauty of it, the gentle rhythm of a world that always found a way to begin again. At the Haggerty Veterans Outreach Center, the atmosphere was calm but purposeful, a soft hum of voices and the steady shuffle of papers and footsteps that felt like the heartbeat of something steady and true. She slipped into the flow of it easily, greeting the veterans and volunteers with a smile that felt stronger today, more sure of itself. She spent the morning learning the small tasks that made the center run, answering the phones, helping an older veteran fill out a form for housing support, setting up coffee for a group of men who gathered every Thursday morning just to talk and remember. And with each quiet moment, she felt her place there grow more real, more rooted. She was still learning, still finding her feet, but she didn't feel like an outsider anymore. She felt like a part of something that mattered, something that saw kindness as a strength instead of a liability. As the morning wore on, she caught sight of Mr. Cole sitting in a worn leather chair by the window, a crossword puzzle in his lap, and a cup of coffee cooling beside him. She hesitated for a moment, then walked over, her voice soft as she said, "Good morning, Mr. Cole." He looked up, his eyes crinkling with that same quiet warmth she'd seen in them the day before. "Morning, Ella," he said, his voice a low rumble that made her think of river stones and the steady hush of rain. She sat down beside him, and for a few moments they just watched the street outside, the slow parade of people and cars moving through the soft light of the day. "I wanted to thank you," she said finally, her hands folded in her lap, "for standing up for me, for being there when I needed it." He chuckled softly, the sound like a gentle wave rolling over smooth stones. "It wasn't just for you," he said, his voice quiet but certain. "It was for every time someone looked at a man like me and saw a burden instead of a person, for every time someone forgot what it meant to be decent." She let his words settle into the quiet space between them, the weight of them both heavy and comforting. "I hope I can do the same here," she said softly, and he nodded, his eyes holding hers with a steadiness that made her feel seen, really seen. "You already are," he said, and in that moment she felt something inside her settle, a quiet click of understanding that told her she didn't have to prove herself here. She just had to show up, again and again, with her quiet acts of kindness and her steady heart. They sat like that for a long while, the city moving slowly around them, and she realized that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply be present, to let someone know they're not alone. When she finally rose to leave, Mr. Cole reached out and squeezed her hand, his grip surprisingly strong for someone whose hands had seen so many years. "Keep going, Ella," he said, and she nodded, her smile small but bright. "I will," she promised, and as she walked back to her desk, she felt lighter somehow, as if the rain had washed something clean inside her and left behind only the simple, unwavering truth that she was enough, that her kindness was enough, and that no matter how small her actions might seem, they could still make a difference. She didn't need to change the whole world. She just needed to hold onto her small corner of it with both hands, to let her quiet strength be the thing that kept her moving forward. And as she poured another cup of coffee and listened to the low murmur of conversation around her, she knew that was exactly what she would do. As the day wound down, the soft light of the late afternoon turned the walls of the outreach center into a warm glow that felt like a gentle promise of safety, and Ella found herself lingering by the window, her hands wrapped around a mug of coffee that had long gone cold. She watched the slow drift of clouds across the sky, their soft shapes shifting and breaking apart, like the old fears she was finally learning to leave behind. Behind her, The quiet murmur of conversation wove through the air, each voice a thread in the small, steady tapestry of community that had begun to feel like home. She turned when she heard the soft shuffle of footsteps and saw Monica standing in the doorway, a gentle smile on her lips. "We're closing up soon," she said, her voice low and kind, and Ella nodded, setting her mug down and brushing a stray lock of hair from her face. "I'll help with the last of the cleanup," she said, her voice sure, and Monica just nodded, her eyes warm with understanding. "Thank you, Ella," she said simply. And in those 3 words, Ella heard everything she had been hoping to hear since that morning in the cafe, when everything she thought she knew had been turned upside down. She moved through the center with a quiet purpose, wiping down counters and straightening chairs, her movements calm and steady. And with each small task, she felt herself stitching a new story out of the remnants of the old. She caught glimpses of the veterans as they filtered out, each one pausing to say a soft word of thanks or a quiet goodbye. And she met each one with a small smile, a gentle nod that said she understood the weight of what they carried. The last to leave was Mr. Cole, his thin shoulders held straight beneath the worn jacket that seemed to hold a lifetime of memories. He paused at the door and turned back to her, his eyes soft in the fading light. "You did good today," he said, his voice rough with emotion, and she felt her throat tighten, her eyes burning with unshed tears. "I just did what felt right," she said, her voice a whisper in the quiet, and he nodded once, a small solemn gesture that felt like a benediction. "That's all any of us can do," he said. And then he was gone, the door closing behind him with a soft click that echoed in the quiet room. She stood there for a long moment, her hands resting on the counter as she let the weight of the day settle around her. It felt like the gentle settling of dust after a storm, the calm after the surge of something powerful and true. She let out a slow breath, her chest easing with the knowledge that she had not been alone, not really, and that what she had done had mattered in ways she was only beginning to understand. As she turned off the lights and locked the door behind her, she felt the city wrap around her like a soft, dark quilt, the glow of the street lamps painting pools of gold on the wet pavement. She walked slowly, her steps careful and deliberate, each one a small, quiet prayer that she would carry this new strength with her, that she would not let it slip away when the world tried to tell her she was too small, too soft. She paused at the corner and looked back at the center, the small building a quiet beacon in the dark, and she felt a smile bloom on her lips. Small and sure, she had found something here, something she hadn't even known she was looking for. And she wasn't about to let it go, not now, not ever. She turned away from the center and started down the street, her hands tucked into her pockets and her head held high, the air cool and damp against her skin, but her heart warm in her chest. And as she walked, she whispered to herself, a quiet promise in the hush of the night, "I will keep going." And she knew she would, because there was no going back now, only forward, and she was ready. The night was quiet and still as Ella reached the small apartment she called home, the scent of wet earth and the gentle hush of distant traffic drifting through the cracked windows she left open to let in the cool air. She set her bag down on the small wooden table, its surface scarred with years of small scratches that felt like memories etched into the grain, and she sank into the worn armchair by the window, her eyes catching the faint reflection of herself in the dark glass. For a moment she just sat there, her breath a soft rhythm in the quiet, her hands folded loosely in her lap as she let the weight of the day settle around her like a gentle tide. She thought of everything that had happened, the hushed cafe, the veterans' calm voices cutting through Harvey's brittle control, the way her own fear had cracked open to reveal something steady and fierce beneath. And she felt a quiet wonder in her chest, a soft glow that spread through her ribs like warmth on a winter morning. She thought of Mr. Cole's quiet dignity and the way he had walked out of the cafe with his head held high, of the small kind words that had followed her since, each one a reminder that kindness didn't need to be loud to be strong. She thought of Sam and Ben and the way their voices had grown stronger as they stood beside her, and she felt a fierce tenderness for the small, brave acts that had carried them all through. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the business card Charles had given her, the edges soft from where her fingers had traced them over and over, and she felt a slow smile spread across her lips, small and certain, because she knew that this wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning. She would start work at the outreach center in the morning, And though the thought of stepping into that space still made her chest flutter with nerves, it also filled her with a quiet joy. The knowledge that she was walking into a place that valued the very thing she had always carried in her heart. A simple, unshakable belief that people deserved to be seen, to be heard, to be treated like they mattered. She let out a slow breath and leaned her head back against the chair, her eyes closing as she let the soft sounds of the city at night wash over her. The hum of tires on wet pavement, the distant bark of a dog, the quiet whisper of the wind through the narrow alleyways. And in that gentle symphony, she found a peace she hadn't known she'd been searching for. She whispered to herself, "You're here." And she felt the truth of it settle into her bones. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, what small battles she might face or what quiet triumphs she might discover. But she knew she would face them with the same quiet courage that had carried her through the storm of that cafe. And as she drifted off to sleep, the soft glow of the street lamp painting the room in honeyed light, she dreamed of 1,000 small kindnesses stacked like bricks to build something new, something strong and beautiful. And she knew that whatever happened next, she would not turn away. She would not be silent. She would not let anyone tell her that her kindness was a weakness, because she had seen with her own eyes how a single act of decency could crack open a room, a heart, a city. And she was ready to keep going, ready to stand tall in the quiet moments and the loud ones, to meet each day with the steady, gentle strength that had carried her this far and would carry her as far as she was willing to go. And as she slept, the city hummed around her, a quiet promise that she was not alone, that she had never been alone. And she knew with every beat of her heart that she was exactly where she was meant to be. If this story moved you, take a moment to share it. Let someone know that small acts of kindness can change the world in ways we never see coming. Because in a world that too often tells us to look away, it's the quiet, unyielding courage of people like Ella that remind us of who we can be. If you've ever chosen compassion over convenience, if you've ever seen someone who needed help and offered it without question, you're part of this story too. So, leave a comment, share your thoughts, and let us know. Have you ever witnessed kindness stand taller than power? Subscribe to Blacklens Stories for more real-life tales of decency and courage that prove even the smallest voice can make a difference. Because sometimes, it only takes one person to remind us what matters most.